Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, disturbing books. I've got a review for you of The End of Alice by A.M. Holmes. So this is one of the books I've read for my Disturbing Books project, where I'm reading books that have been recommended to me in the comments on various videos. So I've made a number of videos over the last year or so about disturbing books, starting with one about a book called Notice by Heather Lewis, which was a video that kind of blew up for me. Did very well, got lots of views and loads of comments, and people in the comments on that video started recommending other disturbing books. I've made a list and I'm gradually working my way through them. And The End of Alice was a book that came up again and again in the comments. A lot of people said it was very disturbing, to the extent that I was quite anxious going into it. I was nervous about what I was going to find within these pages. I actually did it in the end as a buddy read on my Discord with one of my viewers, Wilhelmina, and Anne from the channel Anne Novella. And Anne actually tapped out partway through. And I'm not surprised. I can see why. This is a very troubling and definitely a disturbing book. But is it a good book? I think that's a different question. So I'll talk about that in a minute. I'll talk about my impressions of the book. But what I wanted to talk about first was this question, a question that has come up again and again in the comments on my Disturbing Books videos of, why read disturbing books? Why put yourself through that? And I think it's a really valid question. I did make a video a while ago where I answered that question, and I'll try and remember to link to that video in case you want to watch it. But briefly, I think there's a number of different reasons why you might want to read disturbing books, and why I, as an individual, get something out of reading disturbing books. So part of it, I think, is kind of an insight into the darker side of the world. So we know that there are horrible things out there that happen, and sometimes it can be difficult to understand why those things happen. And we seek that knowledge sometimes. We seek understanding to help us make sense of the world. So I think that's one of the reasons. Another reason, maybe for people, it may be a way of addressing, like visiting their own fears, confronting their own fears, and maybe processing traumatic events that have happened to them. And I think it's also a way that you can build empathy with other people. So I said earlier that it's a way of understanding the terrible things that happen in the world. Sometimes when you see those things on the news, it's very difficult to make an emotional connection with the people you're hearing about. Reading about disturbing horrific things in fiction, where you have more time to make those connections with the characters, I think is a useful way to build empathy with the victims of war and tragedy and all sorts of terrible things. So those are some of the reasons why I read disturbing books. And I think there's another reason, which isn't necessarily a reason why I read them, but I definitely think it's a reason why some people read them, which is just about pushing your limits. So understanding the limits of what you can take. We see that in, when people go and watch horror movies and things like that. And as a big fan of horror, that is one of the reasons why I enjoy horror. That sense of, seeing how frightened I can get, but then knowing I can walk away from it safely at the end. It's the same reason why, people ride roller coasters and things like that. So there is, to an extent, I think that's another reason why people may read disturbing books. And I think that there's a big movement at the moment, isn't there, in terms of extreme horror. So, we had kind of splatterpunk in the 80s and 90s, and more recently there are a lot of, particularly independent authors who are, writing books that they describe as extreme horror, that really push the limits in terms of the amount of gore and violence and, often sexual violence and things like that, horrific things on the page. And people, I think, do read those books to test themselves, to see how much they can take. And extreme horror tends to get a bad rap. I'm not, a massive fan of extreme horror, and I've talked about that on the channel before. I think it often lacks that emotional connection, which I think is important for works of disturbing fiction to make them truly disturbing. What you often end up with, in my experience at least, with extreme horror, is just a list of horrible things happening, without giving the reader a way to make a real connection with the victims of the horrible things. it can feel a bit pointless. And that's what I felt too about The End of Alice. So The End of Alice is definitely not a book you would label as an extreme horror book. This is a work of literary fiction. A.M. Holmes is a well-respected author, not an author I'd read before, but a well-respected author who's written a number of different books, and this book is is blurbed by like the LA Times and authors like Ali Smith and Will Self. So well-respected people, certainly people you wouldn't get blurbing extreme horror books. And this edition is from Granta, who are a very literary publisher. It's got kind of fancy French flaps, so this is this is a posh intellectual book just by the way it's presented. But I don't think it is a particularly smart or interesting book. So let me tell you. Let me cut to the chase and tell you what it's about. So if you don't know already, it's about a remote relationship between a child murderer and paedophile who's in prison, and a young woman on the outside who is herself a paedophile. So that's an immediately intriguing concept, I think, for a book, but one that is immediately disturbing. And the thing that is, I think, a problem for this book is there's a very, very famous relationship in fiction that is similar to that between a young woman on the outside who's trying to gain understanding and an older monster, a very erudite monster, as the monster, the imprisoned child killer in The End of Alice is, in prison, giving advice and guidance to this younger person. And that relationship clearly is a relationship between Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling in Silence of the Lambs. And that was just a shadow that was just cast over this book. It was published after Silence of the Lambs came out, both book and movie. And it really, the similarities are really quite jarring, particularly in the way the killer kind of presents himself in the book as, quite an intellectual character, and someone who is, who feels himself to be smarter than the world around him. So that was a big problem for me. What you then get plot-wise is kind of two twin plots, one about each of the two characters. So the kind of backstory to how the killer ended up in prison, and his own kind of self delusionment, I guess, and then also the story of the increasing crimes of this young woman on the outside. So there is definitely dark and disturbing stuff here. It's not a book I would recommend anybody goes into lightly. There's horrible, disturbing stuff in this book. There's no question of that. It's a troubling book. But what it lacks is a point. And when I go back to that question of why read disturbing books, for me, the best disturbing books I've read, the books that have really made a difference to me, Notice by Heather Lewis being one, Hog by Samuel Delany in some ways being another, and that was even more disturbing. Well, I think Notice is more disturbing overall to me, but Hog is horrific at times. But it felt like it was written with a purpose, as did Notice. Notice feels like a book that Heather Lewis wrote to process her own trauma, whereas The End of Alice feels a lot like those extreme horror books where extreme horror authors are just trying to push the envelope as much as they can and be as shocking as possible. The End of Alice feels a lot like that. It feels like an exercise in writing rather than a book that has something interesting to say. And the other shadow that is cast over this book is the shadow of Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, which is a book that where the central character in Lolita is a similar character to the villain, the imprisoned guy in this book, and has that same kind of self-delusion about the terrible things that he's doing. The difference is that Lolita does that far, far better than The End of Alice does. Lolita does that brilliantly, and I think Lolita is a brilliant book because of that. The End of Alice feels like someone trying to kind of almost pastiche that, and I don't think A.M. Holmes does nearly a good job as Nabokov does. So those, the shadows of those two other things were cast over this book for me, which ruined my enjoyment of it. Enjoyment being the wrong word. lessened my appreciation of it, shall we say, as a work of fiction. And as I say, I feel like it doesn't provide any fresh insight into anything. It just feels like an exercise in trying to write about horrible things and put yourself in the mind of a monster. And I don't think there is a point to this book as a result of that, and therefore would not recommend anyone reading it, even if you are someone who likes sampling different types of disturbing fiction. I think there are much more interesting and better books out there to read. So I hope you found that interesting. As I said, I definitely don't recommend reading this book, but if you have read it and have views of your own, please do leave them in the comments. I'd be interested to chat about it there. Anyway, I will leave it there and say, as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.